The man in the tan suit refused to stand when Judge Caprio entered, and before the clerk could even finish the case number, he lifted his chin, stared straight at the bench, and announced, "I do not consent to these proceedings." A murmur swept the courtroom like wind through dry leaves. 2 rows back, a grandmother in a wool coat clutched her purse tighter. At the prosecution table, a school crossing guard with a brace on her wrist lowered her eyes and breathed through visible fear. Then the defendant smiled, slow and contemptuous, as if the entire room existed beneath him. In that cold courtroom light, with the flag hanging motionless and the air feeling suddenly too thin, everybody understood the same thing at once. This was not going to be a routine hearing. Something was about to snap. Judge Caprio looked down from the bench with that familiar stillness that had broken better men than this one. Calm, his robe sat clean and dark against the pale wood behind him. His glasses rested low on his nose. His face was calm, almost kind, but his eyes were already measuring the moral temperature in the room, and the temperature had dropped fast. At the defense table sat Leonard Voss, a self-declared sovereign citizen wrapped in a sand-colored jacket, a cheap gold tie pin, and the kind of theatrical confidence that only survives when nobody important has challenged it yet. He had 3 binders stacked beside him, each stuffed with printed internet jargon, fake seals, and documents stamped in red ink as though a stamp could turn nonsense into law. And if you've ever watched arrogance walk into a courtroom convinced it outranks truth, then you already know why stories like this spread, why people lean in, why they hit like and subscribe before the verdict even lands, because sometimes justice doesn't just arrive, it exposes. The case on paper looked simple enough. A school zone violation, disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, and intimidation of a public employee. Leonard insisted it was all fraudulent. He said the city had no authority over him, that his vehicle was private conveyance, that the officer who arrested him had committed kidnapping, and that the crossing guard, Elena Marquez, had fabricated the entire thing because she was trained to obey revenue collection systems. He said it in a voice slick with condescension, each word sharpened not by intelligence but by contempt. Elena sat small but upright at the other table in a navy cardigan and sensible shoes, her dark hair pinned back, her left wrist wrapped where she had fallen. She was 61 years old, widowed, and had worked the same elementary school crosswalk for 11 years. Her posture was careful, almost painfully controlled, like someone holding herself together in public by sheer will. When Judge Caprio asked Elena to speak, her voice trembled only for the first sentence. She said Leonard's black SUV tore through the school zone while children were still crossing. She stepped forward with her stop sign raised, and instead of braking, he accelerated, clipping the sign, forcing her backward onto the curb. She fell. Her wrist struck the pavement. Parents screamed. Children cried. Leonard, she said, rolled down his window and told her she was not a real person under natural law. Even then, she did not dramatize it. She didn't need to. The quiet dignity in her voice did more damage to him than any performance ever could. Leonard snorted loudly and threw one hand in the air. She's a crossing guard, not a constitutional scholar. People like her think a vest and a whistle make them authority. The courtroom went silent, dead silent. Even the fluorescent hum seemed louder after that. Elena's face did not crumple, but something in it tightened, some old hurt mixing with fresh humiliation. A man in the gallery muttered, "Unbelievable." Judge Caprio folded his hands and regarded Leonard with the kind of patience that feels to the guilty like a slow closing door. "Mr. Voss," he said softly, "ignorance becomes arrogance the moment it starts looking down on decency." That's when everything changed. Leonard leaned into his routine, certain it had impressed lesser minds before. He called himself a free traveler. He challenged the spelling of his name on the citation. He claimed the gold fringe on a courtroom flag, which did not even exist in that room, invalidated jurisdiction. He said the officer had no lawful authority to demand identification. He even held up a laminated card declaring himself a non-corporate flesh and blood man, and for one brief, absurd second, he seemed proud of it. But Judge Caprio did not argue philosophy with him. He asked precise questions. Was the school zone active? Yes. Were children present? Yes. Did he stop when directed by a designated crossing guard? No. Did he produce a valid license? Leonard began answering less like a prophet and more like a man stumbling through a bad script. Then the prosecutor requested permission to play bodycam footage from Officer Daniel Reese, the arresting officer. Leonard smirked as if he were about to be vindicated. He leaned back, crossed one leg, straightened his cuffs. That smugness lasted exactly 7 seconds into the video. The screen lit the courtroom in cold blue-gray tones. The bodycam showed chaos first. Children huddled on the sidewalk, backpacks bright against the concrete. Elena sitting on the curb, pale and shaken, one parent kneeling beside her, Leonard's SUV idling 20 feet ahead with a fake cardboard plate in the rear window reading private. Officer Reese approached the driver's side, calm and professional, asking for license and registration. Leonard answered with immediate hostility. "Am I being detained by contract?" he snapped. "You work for a corporation. I do not answer to employees." The officer asked again. Leonard began filming back with his own phone, calling the officer a costumed debt collector. A few people in the gallery laughed bitterly under their breath. Then came the moment that turned irritation into outrage. In the footage, Elena, still holding her wrist, stepped carefully toward the vehicle and said, softly, "Sir, there were children in the crosswalk." Leonard turned, looked directly at her and said, "If you got scared, retire. People like you are replaceable." Gasps burst through the courtroom. The courtroom went silent again a beat later, heavier this time because now everyone had heard him with his own mouth. Leonard's posture changed. Not much, just enough. One shoulder tensed. His jaw set too hard. The binders no longer looked powerful. They looked childish, but Judge Caprio was not finished watching. The body cam continued. Officer Reese informed Leonard that his license was suspended. Leonard laughed and said licenses were for commercial slaves. When the officer ordered him out of the vehicle, Leonard locked his arms against the wheel and began shouting about admiralty law, maritime fraud, and unlawful seizure. 2 backup officers arrived. Leonard demanded a supervisor, then demanded a common law jury, then began chanting, "I do not consent," louder and louder as if repetition could rewrite reality. Finally, when Officer Reese reached in to disengage the vehicle, Leonard jerked the wheel and nearly struck the officer's arm. The struggle that followed was ugly, fast, and entirely of Leonard's making. He kicked, spat, and screamed that everyone present would be personally lined into poverty. The bailiff paused the footage there, but not before one more detail flashed on screen. In the passenger seat sat a stack of envelopes, each bearing Elena Marquez's name and home address. A whisper raced through the room. Judge Caprio asked Elena if she recognized the envelopes. Her fingers tightened around the rail as she nodded. After the arrest, she said, she had begun receiving documents at home accusing her of treason, threatening property seizure, and demanding $10,000 for interference with natural travel. One letter said she and her dead husband's estate could be commercially harvested if she testified. She had brought them with her because she had been too frightened to throw them away. That landed harder than the video, because now this was no longer just a traffic stop. Now it was pattern, harassment, intimidation, cowardice dressed up as ideology. Leonard tried to cut in, suddenly louder, suddenly ragged around the edges. He said the letters were lawful notices. He said Elena was overreacting. Then, in the worst mistake of his day, he turned toward her and muttered, not quite under his breath, "You should have stayed on the sidewalk and minded your class." The courtroom went dead silent. Judge Caprio's expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for every person in the room to feel the floor drop beneath Leonard Voss. "Mr. Voss," the judge said, "you seem to mistake self-importance for sovereignty." It hit like a blade. Even Leonard knew it. His mouth opened, but for the first time since the hearing began, nothing useful came out. The late unraveling came quickly after that. The prosecutor introduced certified DMV records showing Leonard had been driving on a suspended license for 8 months. The fake plate was not a principle. It was concealment. School surveillance footage from the corner camera showed the crosswalk lights flashing and children already in motion when Leonard entered the zone. A parent witness described grabbing her daughter by the hood to keep her from stepping forward. Another officer testified that Leonard had used the same pseudo-legal threat letters in 2 prior stops. Piece by piece, the mystique drained away, leaving only what had been there all along, a bully with a printer. And then Judge Caprio spoke at length, his voice low, controlled, devastating in the way only real moral clarity can be. Mr. Voss, let me explain something you have spent a long time avoiding. The law is not a buffet where you take protection and decline responsibility. Roads, schools, public safety, the right of children to cross a street without being killed by a man performing internet theater in an SUV, those are not optional simply because you have memorized nonsense and bound it in plastic. You did not come into this courtroom as some fearless defender of liberty. You came here as a man who endangered children, insulted a woman doing honest work, resisted lawful arrest, and then harassed that woman at home because her courage offended your ego. Sovereignty without responsibility is just selfishness wearing a costume, and intimidation is the language of cowards who discover, too late, that the truth has a recording. No one moved, no one coughed. The courtroom went silent in that deep, almost sacred way it does when justice has found the exact center of a person and pressed. Leonard looked down at his binders as if they had betrayed him. His face, which had entered the room glowing with superiority, now seemed strangely bare. The arrogance went first, then the defiance. What remained was collapse. Judge Caprio found him responsible on the traffic and conduct counts before the court, referred the harassment letters and threats for criminal review, ordered no contact with Elena Marquez, and remanded him into custody on the suspended license and intimidation matters pending further proceedings. It was not merely procedural, it felt like the room itself had rejected him. Elena closed her eyes for a moment after the ruling, and when she opened them she looked different, still gentle, still shaken, but stronger now, as if being believed in public had returned something to her that fear had tried to take. Parents in the gallery nodded at her as she stepped away from the table. Officer Reese tipped his head respectfully. Even the clerk's face softened. In the weeks that followed, the school installed additional camera coverage at the crosswalk. Other recipients of Leonard's fake legal threats came forward. The recording spread online, not because people enjoy chaos, but because people recognize the rare and satisfying sight of cruelty finally meeting a wall it cannot talk through. Elena returned to her post with a sturdier wrist brace and the same stop sign, and the children, who had heard more than adults realized, started waving to her with a tenderness that made parents look away and swallow hard. That is what justice looks like when fantasy crashes into fact. Not loud for the sake of being loud, clear, final, human. If that body cam moment hit you the second Leonard's own words buried him, tell me in the comments exactly when you knew Judge Caprio had him figured out, and if you believe dignity, duty, and plain decency should always outrank arrogance in a cheap tie. Like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who still needs the reminder that truth does not need permission to stand.